Please note, this podcast series features graphic descriptions of forensic pathology techniques, violent crimes, accidents, and traumatic incidents that some listeners may find distressing or upsetting. 2 weeks into his new job at a forensic facility, Roger Byard got a phone call that would not only have a profound impact on his own life and career, but also on the tiny SA town of Snowtown and the whole of South Australia. Today, Roger details the forensic aspects of the Snowtown investigation and the unique challenges that gruesome killings presented. And he also reveals his prevailing memories of one of the world's most shocking acts of evil. From The Advertiser, True Crime Australia and the University of Adelaide, this is Guardians of the Dead, a podcast exploring the ground where death and science meet. I'm Greg Barilla.
Hi everyone, I'm Elisa Black and I'm back again today with Roger Byard. How long had you been a forensic pathologist when you first got the call about Snowtown?
Approximately 2.5 weeks. I'd done forensics for years, but I hadn't worked in a forensic facility, so I'd been working part-time at Forensic Science SA and then decided to move from the Children's Hospital down to forensics. And it was my first week on call, and got a phone call Thursday night about 9 o'clock, and it was the head of major crime who just said to me, "G'day, Doc, Paul Schramm here, head of major crime." I said, "G'day, how are you?" And he said, "It's a bit strange, really. I mean, there's a little place called Snowtown in a bank vault, and it's lined by plastic, and there are all these barrels." And I said, "Oh, hydroponic?" He said, No, it doesn't smell like it." And he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, why don't you take a lid off, and if there's a foot, give us a call back." You know, typical black humour. That was the last thing I was thinking. And so about 10 minutes later, he phones me back and says they're actually 2 feet.
It's the crime that shook the country and changed the identity of a small South Australian town forever.
It became very apparent to those police officers that it was highly likely that there were bodies in that room.
Police entered the old State Bank building in Snowtown's main street.
11 brutal killings where body parts were stuffed in barrels. Stuffed into 6 plastic barrels hidden inside a disused bank vault in the state's mid-north.
Absolutely sick. I mean, we're just a quiet little country town.
And I said, you're kidding me. I said, "How many barrels?" 6 barrels. So it was like nothing I'd ever even considered. And
So did you just get straight in the car and drive out there?
no, going to a scene, you go to a scene really to determine time of death and what has happened. And because you've got these bodies in barrels, really the crime scene's in the barrels. So the thing to do is to look at the bank vault, obviously, which is what Forensic Response did, but also bring the barrels down to us in town.
So the first you saw was walking into a room and the barrels is the first thing you're confronted with, or are the bodies already sort of out of the barrels?
No, they were in the loading bay at Forensic Science on Friday morning. And we're thinking, what do we do? And we thought, well, if they've used some sort of horrible chemicals to dissolve the bodies, then that could be a danger. So we undid one of the barrels and took some samples, and that was analysed. And it really wasn't much. They'd used acid, but because they hadn't used enough, it had neutralised. So basically, there was no toxic chemical danger. But then we had to work out, how do you empty barrels? What's in there? How do you do it without losing evidence?
And so how do you make those decisions when this is the first time you've been faced with a case like this?
Well, there's a team, obviously. So there's the forensic pathologist, there are the forensic scientists, crime scene, major crime. So we're in charge of how it's handled. But just getting the barrels into the mortuary, we're thinking, well, whatever's in there we need to preserve. So, we took the lids off and then basically sieved the fluid. And then removed the bodies. Some were intact, some had been dismembered. Looked for clothing, looked for weapons, looked for any injuries. Some of the bodies were incredibly well preserved. And it's a strange thing with that sort of environment. There's a lack of oxygen, so you don't get bacteria proliferating. So when bodies decompose, You get putrefaction, you get autolysis. Putrefaction is when the bacteria crawl all through you. Autolysis is when stuff just breaks down. And so they basically autolyzed. So it was extremely difficult. And of course, you know, the skin where it was intact, the colour had changed. So looking for bruises and injuries was complicated.
What was the mood like in the mortuary when you first began this task?
That was surreal because we didn't know what might be in there. So we just worked barrel by barrel, sieving the remains, looking into the sieve to see if there's anything there, and then bringing the remains out onto tarpaulins and photographing them and looking for thumb locks that were found in gags, ligatures, that sort of thing. And then once they were out and in body bags, we could then process them as cases in the coming days.
How long did that whole process take?
That's a good question. I don't know, probably about 10 days, because then, as well as the bodies in the barrels, there were other cases. There were the two people from Waterloo Corner, Davies and Allen, Suzanne Allen, and they'd been buried, so they came in a few days later.
2 more bodies were discovered buried in the backyard of a suburban home.
Officers have dug up bags of human remains in a backyard north of Adelaide. A convicted pedophile is thought to be among the victims.
Another 4 victims were later linked to the case. Their deaths were soon dubbed the Snowtown murders.
And then there were a couple of cases before that had already been processed. So it was a very sort of complicated scenario.
How do you go about identifying those people who've suffered such awful crimes and whose bodies might not be in a state that many of us would recognise?
Well, everybody thinks that DNA is the bee's knees. But the problem was the DNA had been affected by the storage, so it didn't work. And people were saying, well, you know, you can identify dinosaurs from DNA. Why can't you identify these people? But it's a moist, initially acid environment, so it breaks the DNA down.
All through the body. I had no idea that was a thing.
Yep. So that wasn't particularly useful. But there were tattoos. Also, there were missing people. So, you know, the police had been following this for quite a while, so they knew who was possibly there. Stature, dental work. Dental teeth are very important because everybody has unique fillings and unique teeth. So they were the major identifiers, and the people were identified.
Was there anything especially, and I imagine this entire case was shocking for a number of reasons, but was there anything especially surprising that came out during that process?
The whole case. I mean, as it evolved through the courts and we found out what these people had been doing to them, the torture and just the depravity of it. A lot of what happened we didn't find at autopsy because the tissues were decomposing. But in the court it came out that they'd been crushing toes with pliers, they'd been electrocuting them, they'd been using cigarette burns, they'd putting sparklers into their genitals. Really, really evil stuff.
They've charged 3 Adelaide men with murder.
John Justin Bunting, Robert Joe Wagner and James Spiridon Vlasakis murdered 11 people between them.
Set about systematically torturing and murdering their victims during the early 1990s.
Which would uncover a tale of torture.
The victims were the men's own family members and friends, and many were horrifically tortured before they were killed.
The prosecution claimed the motive was an intense hatred of paedophiles and homosexuals. Others were killed because they knew too much.
Prosecutors alleged there was a 12th murder victim, but a jury couldn't reach a verdict on her death.
We're talking torture, we're talking cannibalism, we're talking the most depraved physical acts one can commit upon another person.
So what are you able to establish at autopsy besides identity, or is that about as far as you were able to go with this particular case?
Oh, we could identify where there were gags and, you know, the possibility of choking. There was one case, it was Suzanne Allen, who basically there was nothing really to find. And so the suggestion in court was, well, how do you know that she hadn't died of a heart attack and then they just disposed of the body? Well, you don't know. So I think that they didn't pursue that one.
So even if you discover bodies in situations like that, which is obviously so unnatural, you still have to go through the process to make sure they haven't died of natural causes? Like, are you still looking at the heart to make sure that the heart is in a healthy state?
Well, it's complicated because you get these cases where a little old lady will be in a shopping centre and somebody will mug her and steal her bag and she'll drop dead of a heart attack. Well, the attack has caused that. And, you take your victim as you find them. So just because somebody's got a medical condition does not let people off the hook if they've initiated the death.
What was the mood like of the sort of the police officers that you were working with during that time as well? I imagine that this is, again, for them, who obviously are very used to violent crimes, but again, this was just something that was so mind-blowing for, people on the street, and I imagine professionals as well.
It's interesting. I think for the pathologists, I won't say it's easier, but we've got a job to do. We have to work out who this might be, what might have happened, what injuries are there, what fits together. Whereas to be an observer just watching, I think that can be really quite confronting because you see the whole panorama. When I go overseas to colleagues' institutes, I find it a bit confronting going to their mortuaries because I'm aware of the smell, I'm aware of what's going on. I'm not sort of thinking scientifically. So I think there was a fair amount of trauma with the people who weren't actually involved in handling the bodies.
And then you were involved in the court cases as well as a witness, is that right?
Yes. I've never seen so much media in my life. It's extraordinary. But the pathology was important.
So what memories stand out the most for you from that time?
Well, the smell still does. But as I said, I've been at the Women's and Children's doing paediatric pathology, and then I'd moved to this. So about 4 o'clock in the morning, Saturday morning, I just sat bolt upright in bed, just looked at the dog, she was sleeping on the floor, and said, what have I done? I've moved from SIDS to this. So I went and got a coffee and just sat there and thought about it, and it is just so confronting. And there have only been a couple of instances in my professional life where I've had nightmares about cases, and this one I had nightmares for probably 3 or 4 nights. I dreamt the bodies were in the back of a ute and they were coming alive, which just shows you the impact that it had, I think.
The Snowtown case was just on another level completely.
I think undoubtedly it is the worst serial murder case that Australia has ever seen.
It's been the longest and most expensive criminal case in the state's history. The trial itself took 11 months. That was after 3 years of pre-trial proceedings. Evidence was taken from 227 witnesses and more than 17,000 pages of transcript were produced.
It was just so feral and so evil and so vile.
Bunting and Wagner were both sentenced to life without parole. Vlasakis confessed to 4 of the killings and was jailed for a minimum of 26 years.
Tell me a bit about the other 2 cases that you had mentioned to me before that weren't actually in the barrels but were part of this case.
Well, it's interesting because you had the 8 bodies in the barrels, and then there were 2 who'd been buried at Waterloo Corner, and then going back, Clinton Truscott, he'd been buried at Lower Light in 94. He was apparently their first victim. And then there was a Thomas Trevelyan who was thought to have committed suicide by hanging, but apparently was actually a victim of them. So there were previous cases. And of course the questions then asked, well, if these had been identified, would this have occurred? I don't think you can say that. People ask what was their motivation, and you read about it that they were ripping off Centrelink and doing that, but it's more than that. They were torturing these people. There was a perverse pleasure in what they were doing, and I think that the massive sentences that have been handed down are great. I don't think we want people like that in our society.
What was it like to be involved in a case for such a long time?
You get sort of numbed to it, and it's interesting. I've written a lot and presented a lot on my cases. I've never presented on Snowtown, and I've never written on Snowtown because it was just so massive and so prolonged. there are interesting things to talk about with it, and I've got a draft somewhere, but I just never did it. I don't know. Maybe I was just shell shocked.
I mean, happening so early in your career, I can't even imagine what that must have been like as a kind of an entry to that world. Never caused you to reconsider?
No, because it was fascinating. I mean, it put parking fines into perspective, and it made a lot of the other cases a lot easier. My colleagues internationally were saying, "My God, working in Adelaide, the city of churches and serial killers." So it went around the planet.
We'll be back right after this.
So you mentioned some of the difficulties around trying to get any kind of DNA profile from the bodies because of the conditions that they were kept in. What else did you learn during this case that you've been able to take forward?
Well, it's interesting because, if you strip it back, it is a case and you have to approach it like you approach other cases. So, the first thing is, what has happened here? And, we were wandering around with question marks over our head because we had no idea. How did it happen? Why? Who are these people? That's the process to go through in a very methodical fashion. And then, I was talking earlier, I think in the first episode, about chain of custody, when something's taken off the body. So if we find a gag, it will be photographed on the body, it'll be taken off the body, it'll be given to the crime scene officer, a forensic response officer, who will, say, I received this from Roger Byard at this time on this date, and that will be a piece of evidence. And so there was a lot with Snowtown, huge amount, paper trails and all sorts of things. And you've got to be very methodical about that, because if you slip up, then cases are thrown out of court because the evidence, and we've all seen that in court cases where they didn't have the right to search a car or something like that, and something really crucial was found, but it doesn't exist for the court. So it's just a way of making sure that everything's transparent, everything's done properly. Otherwise, you make massive mistakes.
We see often, when we watch TV shows or movies about forensic pathology, that they're able to nail down a time of death to, within 5 minutes of this or 5 minutes of that. I'm assuming with a case like this, it's almost impossible to work out when somebody may have died. But how closely are you ever able to really establish when somebody might have died?
Well, if I'm sitting in front of somebody and they get shot, then I can be pretty accurate.
Got it.
Yep. The best time of death is, a reliable witness or reliable witnesses. Because although we know process, and we all go through the same process after we die, we're all different. And so I've called this, timing is the Achilles heel of forensic pathology, because, lawyers will want to know to the minute. So, died 2 minutes past midnight plus or minus 2 weeks. I don't know. And that's the problem with forensic programs. They package everything up for an hour, and they're always very accurate.
Buried under concrete, no less.
Got cause of death?
Not till I do a full exam, but he's probably been here since they poured the concrete back in 1978.
The male victim was standing right here, and the killer plunged his knife into the shoulder, severing the carotid artery. And
Jane tried to run, Vinia didn't.
How do you know?
She's half under her desk, which means she tried to hide and the ends up found her.
You got a chapter in one of those books on jumping to conclusions. You attach an assumption to a piece of evidence, you start to bend the narrative to support it.
And it's a problem sometimes with jury trials that they expect this level of precision.
Because so often that's the thing that catches the perp, right? They were there at this time, that's when the person died, so it was him.
Yeah. And what the prosecution want you to do is to limit the time frame, so it reduces the number of people who could be involved, and defence want you to open the time frame so that it could be a number of people. So you're constantly being pulled by both sides.
So if you don't have a reliable witness who was there to see somebody get shot, what is the tightest time frame you've ever been able to establish with confidence?
Well, as soon as you die, your temperature starts to fall. And there are these very complicated charts that came out of Germany that you can actually work out plus or minus 2.5 hours. They're probably the best shot. But, what happens if you've got a fever because you've got the flu, so your temperature's a bit higher? Or you've been sitting out the back, so you're a little cold. If you're an obese person or you're a thin person, there are a whole lot of different factors. You've got certain clothing on or you're not.
What other kind of mistakes are made more frequently than you would, is suggested on TV? What kind of other errors do you see on crime shows that are just so far from the reality of being a forensic pathologist?
Well, I think the precision, like we talked about. I also think that the errors that people make in pathology are often when they make up their mind too quickly. It's obviously this. And then everything sort of fits into that. Whereas what you should do is you should just sort of say, well, we've got all of this, let's work forward. Then once you've actually made up your mind, the thing to do is say, now, where did I go wrong? How did I stuff this up? What are the flaws in my argument? What else could it be? And I worked with a pathologist in Ottawa in Canada, and he was a hospital doctor, and he'd come up with a diagnosis, and he'd say, now, why am I wrong? And that's a really good way, because he had no ego. It was just the whole process, and that's what has to happen. But I think the tradition in, say, British courts, particularly in the middle of the last century, was that, the great man pontificates, and whatever the pathologist says is correct. And that's led to miscarriages of justice, clearly.
Have you seen that happen, where people have taken the information that you've given them, made the wrong kind of connections between pieces of evidence, and then come up with the wrong answer?
Yes, I have. And it's been quite concerning, because the courts accepted this evidence, and I know that it's wrong. Part of the problem with courts is if you get two experts and they're diametrically opposed, often the jury just says, oh, this is all too hard, let's just put that aside. So all you need to do is to raise reasonable doubt. And once that's raised, then, well, who knows? So
going back to Snowtown, were there any questions that were asked of you that you just, I'm sure much to your chagrin, you just couldn't answer with any certainty? Well,
time of death was one, because the bodies have been stored, had no idea, and they're in variable stages, and that didn't really depend on when they've been killed. So really all we could do is exclude gunshots, see if there were any obvious injuries, and then help with the identification.
So as well as time of death, and I know that there's obviously different ways that in the movies and TV they use to try and establish that, but whether you've got food in your stomach or when you could work out that they've got their sandwich in there from lunchtime and it's now whatever time, they've still got some sandwich left. So they must have been killed straight after that happened.
Well, if we look at the whole process of, you die, your temperature cools, you get livor mortis where the, blood settles, and you get rigor mortis when the muscles stiffen. And then one of the parameters that was used was how quickly the stomach empties, gastric emptying time. And there have been a number of cases where this has been a problem. There's the Truscott case in Canada, I think, where it was found to be inaccurate. And the reality is that everybody's stomach empties differently. And if it's fluid, it's different to solid. And if people get stressed, then their stomach won't empty. So if you get somebody who gets hit on North Terrace by a car and is in ICU for 3 days, they may still have stuff in their stomach that they ate 10 minutes before the accident. So all you can say is when you find food in the stomach, yes, they died after they ate.
So why did that ever become a thing that was used to measure when somebody might have died? How did that start?
I think what forensic pathology tried to do was to be very scientific, and we can work out methods for doing things. We can have these great charts and, we know this and we can predict this. And I think we've just realised that every human is different. Every reaction is different. If somebody gets kidnapped and held hostage, they'll be so stressed. They may empty their entire intestinal tract in 5 minutes, or they may just close down and not empty for days. So again, you can't make any predictions based on this, although people have.
So tell me about the Truscott case you mentioned just before.
Well, it's a case I wasn't involved in, but it's very well known. It was in 1959, and Stephen Truscott was basically sentenced to death for the rape and murder of a young woman who's a school friend.
It is one of those cases that has never really left the public eye. In 1959, a 14-year-old named Stephen Truscott was convicted of murdering a 12-year-old classmate in Clinton, Ontario. His sentence? Death by hanging.
And it took years for the evidence to be analysed, but it was partially based on gastric emptying. And, that was wrong.
After 45 years of being labelled a convicted killer, Stephen Truscott may be able to clear his name. Canada's Justice Minister says he'll announce this week whether Truscott's 1959 conviction for the murder of a Southern Ontario girl will be overturned. Just 14 years old when he was charged, Truscott was originally sentenced to death.
So essentially, the pathology evidence wasn't accurate, but it got this extra weight in court. And this happens. I mean, there's the Sally Clark case I was involved with in the UK, where the pathology there was just not accurate. Yet it gets a life of its own in court, and you see it and you think, oh, that's just not right.
So is gastric emptying still a question that you might be faced with from lawyers now?
No. All you need to say is it's witchcraft, and it's something from the past, and really, as I said, they died after they ate.
So what are your sort of prevailing memories now of Snowtown? Adelaide's such a small place, and I imagine that you probably every now and again bump into somebody you knew during that time or somebody that you'd worked alongside of. What stays with you now?
Oh, I don't know, just a sense of sadness and pointlessness and how horrible it was. I think it was handled very well from the police side, the forensic science side, and forensic pathology. We were very systematic about it. We didn't miss anything. Everything was looked at appropriately. So I think that we did a good job, but the thought of it happening again is not a pleasant thought.
We do have the reputation here in Adelaide as being the serial killing capital. What do you think about that?
I think there's an element of truth in that.
That's the terrifying answer I didn't want.
I'm from Tasmania, and my mates from here say, well, it happens everywhere else. Well, no, it doesn't. We had the family murders. We had the Truro murders. We had Snowtown. We've had Beaumonts. For our size, we're punching above our weight when it comes to nasty crimes.
Why?
Who knows? Was it Stephen King that said that there's a dark underbelly of Adelaide? I don't know.
But if anybody knows that, it's you. Like you see this underbelly, or you at least see the results of this underbelly.
No, I see what comes out. I don't see where it comes from, and I don't understand where it comes from. And it's a good question as to why here. I imagine it could happen anywhere. I think there's depravity in every society. It may just that we've been unlucky.
Guardians of the Dead is brought to you by The Advertiser, True Crime Australia and the University of Adelaide. The show is produced by myself, Greg Barilla. Elisa Black is your host. Mixing and sound design by Emily Dorr. Make sure you're following Guardians of the Dead on your favourite podcast app, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave us a review. In episode 5, we'll explore some of the most unusual cases Roger has seen, from accidental death by sexual asphyxia to misadventures at work. I'm Greg Barilla. Thanks for listening.